Well, my clock just struck noon here in Chicago, so we are going to get started. It is a pleasure to welcome you to the Power of Deep Reading, a conversation with Maryanne Wolf here at the University of Chicago. For those of you who are new to our lifelong learning universe here at the University of Chicago, I'll just share 3 tidbits about the Graham School and the lifelong learning community that we curate. The first tidbit is that we are one of the 3 founding divisions of the University of Chicago, because when William Rainey Harper, our founding president, pictured in front of you, was founding this university with philanthropist John D. Rockefeller, they had a conversation about how they wanted the big ideas in universities not just to reach the students in their own walls, but to reach the world. And so they created the first so-called extension, now the Graham School, in US higher education, with an aim to revolutionize university study and to allow people to engage in big ideas throughout all ages and stages of life. And so that is the proud history that founded the school that you are virtually joining. We are now 132 years into that mission, and we have been trailblazing new paths in lifelong learning ever since. Indeed, the current modality we're using of distance education was actually another contribution of the Graham School. We started the first correspondence classes for credit in our distance learning movement beginning in 1895. So we like to say we've been in this distance learning movement for about 130 years, and we have had many other innovations in terms of how we bring ideas in novel ways to learners to really meet the opportunities for education across all stages of life. And today what that looks like is most of our classes are virtual. They remain small, so a commitment we've always had is to Socratic dialogue and making sure that you learn as much from your peers as the eminent faculty. But they do now include people from around the world simultaneously in ways that are deeply powerful. And we'll hear more from Dr. Wolf about the power of deep reading, which is a practice that is in all of our classrooms at the school. And finally, our classes remain committed to the same goal, which is life enrichment through exploring big ideas that challenge and change the world. And we are thrilled to have programs across art, sciences, and society, and I'll be sure to put into the chat some more information. But you are not here to hear about the Graham School. You are here to learn from Maryanne Wolf. And so let me just briefly introduce her with an acknowledgement that if I read her full bio, we would end up being here for the entire hour, just your learning about her immense accomplishment. She is an advocate for children and literacy around the world. She currently directs the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice in the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. She is the former John DiBaggio Professor of Citizenship and Public Service and Director of the Center for Reading and Language Research at Tufts University. She is the author of over 160 publications and books, including Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain, Dyslexia, Fluency, and the Brain, Tales of Literacy for the 21st Century, and Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World. She has received the highest honors from the International Dyslexia Association and multiple other dyslexia and reading organizations. And most recently, congratulations, she accepted a permanent academician appointment in the Pontifical Academy of Science. So quite an amazing background. And I want to actually start, Maryanne, with the book Proust and Squid, because in that you observe, and I'm going to quote, "We were never born to read." And I was so struck by that comment that we taught ourselves to read only in the last few thousand years. Can you share what you mean by that statement?
Yes, I will, because it's an origin story, Seth, but you are going to be surprised because I'm actually going to give you a prefatory origin story that you and I did not discuss. But I decided I am speaking to all of these people in Illinois and the Midwest, and they think I'm a Bostonian who went to California. And they won't know the origin story of my love of books came about because of Illinois. Because
we like that.
because I grew up in a tiny, tiny town in the southern part of the state, not the city at all. But because it was a small town called El Dorado, the name itself is like a metaphor for the lost dreams, but also a place where one went and could discover the world in the library. And
Yeah.
so my origin story actually, and I know you are, this is unexpected for you, but I want people to realize that my love of reading came about because of a library and because of a strange personal characteristic. You may be surprised to know this, but I have been accused of being loquacious. But when you're a first grader in a 2-room schoolhouse, that's what I had. 4 grades on the left, 4 grades on the right. And by the time I'm in the 2nd grade, I am a problem because I already know I've been listening to the 4th grade material and I talked too much. So saintly Sister Rose Margaret told my parents, who were neither rich nor poor, that they had a problem with their pupil, me. And if they could help, perhaps give a few books. Well, what happened then was that suddenly, and I only found about this later how it happened, suddenly the back of that classroom was filled with books, all about books. Curiously, now that I'm in LA, my first favorite book was all about earthquakes and volcanoes. Little did I know that would come in handy. But it became a place where, like Emily Dickinson, books, she said, became her frigate. And they became my way of learning about places I could never otherwise know. So my love affair with books began in Southern Illinois. And I'm going to finish this part of the story by saying that 3 times in my life, I almost went to the University of Chicago because there was a special scholarship from Little El Dorado to the University of Chicago. But my parents, who loved Notre Dame and St. Mary's, and any of those alums, hello to you. I think especially Maureen and Ali from Peoria. This almost beautiful image of Robert Hutchins was forever etched in my mind. I always wanted to go to the University of Chicago, but something always took me elsewhere. And I've always had a special place in my heart for just what you are doing, for making the big ideas at the heart of the educational process. So even though I never came to University of Chicago and went to that dreaded place on the East Coast that I went to, I always loved the very thought that what a wonderful other parallel life it would have been to have become part of the University of Chicago. So that was one of the big reasons why when you wrote me, I said, yes, to return to the place where it all began, my love of reading in Illinois. So.
Well, wonderful. Well, we're thrilled to have you at the University of Chicago. I think you're winning being at the University of Chicago virtually with LA weather right outside your door. So,
yes, but as you know, the audience may not know that in the last 3 weeks, we've been deluged with atmospheric rivers, with trash cans floating beside us in our streets, then followed by mudslides that trapped us in our house, and only last week, an earthquake. And last night, a main broke. So, there are taxes to the sun.
Yes, well, and we've been dealing with 50-degree weather in January and February. So we're.
I know. I actually still follow Illinois weather and Boston weather so that I feel. But now I can return.
Yes, now you can return to the question of why is this, we were never born to read? What's the science behind that statement?
Yes, and it's actually one of those simple epiphanies that can come in a lifetime. And I was writing a book, Proust and the Squid, as an apologia for reading, for written language. And literally 7 years of work went into it, and looking at the neuroscience, what is the reading brain? When it just ultimately came, just like what Piaget always said, the simple ideas sometimes lead to the most complex. And that's what happened. I realized that genetically, there is not one single gene, not one single region in the brain that was meant by our genetic heritage to read. Now, the reality of that statement has important implications for our talk today on deep reading, because it means that if there is no, if you will, setup for reading like there is for vision, for language, for cognition, if there's no what we call circuit, just like a house has a lighting circuit, well, the brain has circuits for processes. Well, for new cognitive processes that have no genetic basis, the brain has to do something that I always think of as semi-miraculous. It has the capacity to create a new circuit out of the older parts. Now, there's an Achilles strength and an Achilles heel to the fact that this new circuit didn't exist before, and therefore is an example of plasticity. That means it's malleable, it can change, and it can reflect, here's the strength, it can reflect the characteristics of various writing systems. If you look at a Chinese reading brain or a Japanese reading brain, and you look at an alphabet reading brain, you will see there are differences, because in Chinese, we need to have 5,000 characters known. Well, that takes more regions visually than we have to use in the alphabet. So that Chinese reading brain is different. It's able to be different because it's plastic. Now, there are two other implications that I want to emphasize today. I hope there are a lot of former teachers and present educators and teachers out there. They are the greatest backbone of our country. And teaching, how we teach a child to learn to read, also helps shape that brain circuit. Now, oh my goodness, it was Alberto Mangel and Italo Calvino who said that every time we read, we are building. We are, I think Mangel used the term, like geometric progression. We are becoming more and more of what we read. Well, I changed that slightly to say, we are becoming more and more of what and how we read. So the third implication, which has the direct segue into your next question that I know about, is that the brain will reflect the medium that it's reading upon. And so when you think about this circuit, I want almost to give your audience a developmental arc to think about for themselves too. The circuit begins very basically. It's, if you will, a rudimentary circuit that has learned how to connect attention, visual processes with all kinds of language processes, okay? Now, that very simple circuit is not deep reading. It's excellent at just reading the surface of things. Over time, now here's where our teachers and our own life history come into play. Over time, that circuit learns to elaborate itself. Heraclitus said that we can never step in the same river twice. Well, we can never step in the same book twice because that reading brain has changed. It becomes the embodiment of all that it knows, all that it reads. And our teaching helps emphasize how those parts are connected. I'm going to say a parens here before I get into deep reading itself. You can see why my poor teacher, Sister Rose Margaret, accused me of being loquacious. I can never give a 2-second answer.
Although, what a blessing to have that loquaciousness, and
Well,
what a
I'm
perfect
sure she
profession for
didn't
you.
think I was a blessing part of the time. Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa.
There's a Matilda aspect to that story.
Oh, there's a Matilda aspect. Oh, you are so right. But anyway, the teacher has to, if you will, help facilitate the connections. And those connections have to become automatic. Those children who become fluent by 3rd and 4th grade. Now, I say this to you teachers because it's really important. We have to make that circuit as automatic and as connected, explicitly connected as possible. Now, many teachers, and my heart goes out to all teachers, but many teachers do not necessarily think that working on connections between the visual and the language systems are as important as just trying to read and absorb all this wonderful literature. The reality is, and I say this because everybody has to understand that reading brain on however you teach reading, the reading brain circuit, even from the start, is beautifully complex. And and that teacher has to help the child connect the attention to the whatever characters, and in alphabet we are letters to the sounds, the phonemes of the words. But not just that. That has to be practice and practice and practice. But it also has to be connected to the meanings of words and the syntax or the grammar of words. Now, I don't want to lose the audience in my moment here, but I need people to realize this reading brain basic circuit, even the most basic circuit, has to connect the beautiful words and their depth of meaning and use. Now, there are things like morphemes I won't talk about with this audience, but all of it, all of these characteristics of language, vision, and attention have to come together to be automatic so deep reading can start. And that's where I segue a little bit from your question about we were never born to read to we become readers because of what and how we read. And deep reading begins after the child has become, or the individual has become so fluent that the attention can be allocated not to those rules and connections so much as all of the stuff of our most sophisticated thinking processes. And now, if you're ready, Seth, I'm going to talk about deep reading. Are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. I'll just affirm what you said so far. For many of our learners, the most common comment we hear is, I've read this great book before, but when I last read it, I read it entirely differently than I read it today. And so I think many of us just see that as, okay, I've gained life experience. Now I'm going to look at it through that lens. And that's obviously a major part of it. But this idea that the circuitry, and that is influencing exactly how we read. And that is another piece of why the same book by Plato will look different at 18 and 80, I think is a really powerful notion in terms of there being life and experience, and then there being the actual plasticity of our brain and the literal how we're reading it. And both of those things may be interacting in that interpretation that we have that is different at this stage. But you're going exactly where I hoped you would, Maryanne, which is, okay, so there's reading, and here's how we get there, and here's how it develops. We're in a world now where reading is constant. We are reading on our phones. We are reading all over in this digital, information-rich world. Tell us about deep reading and how do you distinguish it from what I consider to be almost the constancy of reading in our lives because of this digital, information-rich, disruptive world that we now inherit?
I'm going to tackle your question, which is such an important one, Seth, by saying that I need people to understand that deep reading is not a given. The last thing I said in my implications of your first question, we were never more meant to read, the implications of a plastic reading circuit are inclusive of what you've just said, what we've read over time, how we've been taught, but also the amount of time that we are spending on different mediums will be reflected in how we use the circuit. So we can develop, and I'm going to go back into deep reading in a second. We can develop this gorgeous deep reading circuit that is filled with background knowledge and the use of all these great cognitive processes that I'll describe in a minute. But we may, because of our time on the screen, become, if you will, circuits that are reflecting what we call affordances of the medium of the screen. And there are different affordances in print reading, reading a book that is physical versus reading a screen. The screen helps us, just as you said, digest, absorb, not absorb, assess vast amounts of information. So we're continuously, if you will, using that circuit, but because we are using a medium that advantages speed of processing and just getting to the end of that particular passage or the end of whatever we're doing, the ephemerality, the transitoriness, the lack of physicality, all advantages quick surface use. Now, I know that Nicholas Carr wrote a book called The Shallows, and there are my European colleagues who talk about the shallowing hypothesis. But what they are all talking about, and I had that conversation years ago with Nicholas Carr, is they're talking about the neglect or atrophying of the time consuming deep reading processes that the child who is fluent is beginning to build, to develop over time. And now I must take 2 or maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. I don't even know how much time we have together, Seth, but to describe what is happening in deep reading on that circuit is that we have enough time and we have learned to turn our attention to how to use the background knowledge we possess to examine whatever we're reading. So background knowledge is much more important than people realize, because a lot of people, especially the young, don't know what they don't know. They assume all they do is just look something up. But what if you don't realize you don't know this? Background knowledge is part of deep reading's beginning. It's taking one of the most important aspects of human beings, which is our ability to make analogies. We make an analogy between what we already know and what is in front of us. In reading, in deep reading, we are taking that analogy and we're using it as the basis to make the really important deep reading processes of what I will call inference, critical analysis, and empathy. Now, these processes help us examine what is in front of us, but they take time. in terms of inference, we're like Sherlock Holmes, but we're also like Miss Marple. We take not only what we know about something, but what we know about the feelings. So we are inferring from what we know and what we feel to what is in front of us. This brings us to this very important word, empathy. I believe one of the most important aspects of reading is something that we should never take for granted. When we immerse, and many people are forgetting how to be immersed or mourning the fact that they are not immersed. But when we are, we literally enter the perspective of others. Now, my theologian, teacher, friend, Father John Dunn from Notre Dame, used the term passing over to describe what happens when we leave our perspective behind to discover another alternative way of thinking, of looking at the universe, of trying on the identity of others, of understanding at a deeper level alternatives to our own thinking. This is extremely important in two ways. It gives us a sense of not only the fact that there are other views that we should take seriously and understand, but other feelings. And I've written about this and spoken about this often because I was so impressed by one of my absolute favorite novelists, Marilynne Robinson, when she had an interview with Barack Obama. I think some of you may have read this book, The Givenness of Things essay by Marilynne Robinson. But Barack Obama wanted to go to her because he considered her and her novels an ambassador of empathy. She is able, through the beauty of her writing, but the depth of her ability to convey what another thinks, she is able to give us a sense of who this other is, how they think, how they feel. Steinbeck did that beautifully. There's so many wonderful authors, but she said something really important to Barack Obama. In fact, this interview might have been in Chicago, I'm not sure. Well, in the Midwest. But she said, the trend towards seeing other as enemy is the most dangerous trend that threatens democracy. Yeah. So the last thing I know your audience may be thinking about when you talk about deep reading is democracy. But you see, reading at its depth gives us a chance to infer what that message is at a depth that is different from simply accepting our own views, which often, as Seth, you and I know and have spoken about, often, because of so much information, is restricted to the familiar silos, and we don't examine them with the same critical analysis that is essential for a democracy. Because critical analysis, and here I'm going to just show you in the brain, critical analysis involves us testing our inferences. It's saying, this is what we know, this is what we see. Is it true? Yeah. Is it misinformation? Is it disinformation? The examination of truth is one of the most important aspects and obligations of us as a citizen. And those people who only go to the familiar may be victims to what's called confirmatory bias, that it confirms what you thought and you believe without examination. This is one of the most dangerous aspects to losing the multiplicity of voices we need in a democracy. We need people not only, however, to understand that there are other viewpoints, but to understand that that needs to be examined as we form our own viewpoints, and that our own viewpoints need to be informed. So I will end this part of deep reading before I go to the last, if you will. This is the penultimate aspect of deep reading. I will go to the ultimate aspect of deep reading after you have a chance to talk, Seth.
Well, this is wonderful. Your talking, I'm sure, is much more exciting to the audience. I'll just say that I think what you've described in scientific terms, I feel in human terms, that, and I really have to almost go back to college because technology has overtaken our lives so meaningfully since then, that there were moments in college where, I would just be set off with a book in the library for hours, and I would come out feeling more connected and differently connected than I can really feel any other time in my life, in the sense that, you would feel the pain of people that you were reading about, and you would feel their journey and story, and you would almost be transported to that time. I remember I went to dinner one night and someone said, "What happened?" I said, "Oh, this, it was a historical figure died." And they said, "Yeah, that was several hundred years ago." And, to me, it was like, I was just so deep into the story and the experience that I really felt it. I mean, in a really personal, deep way. And, I think about how I read today, and I don't have that same type of engagement because it's rare that, I'm really away for hours at a time with a book without any connection to technology or other things. And I can see how transformative it is to be able to transport your place, and how that really affects how we look at issues in a democracy, how we humanize other perspectives. So just affirming everything you've said as an anecdotal level to the very incredible science that you bring to it. Let's come though to this question, which you've already described. So, technology is influencing us. And one of the ways that you describe that in your book, and in a recent conversation I heard with you and Ezra Klein, is how technology is actually meaningfully creating new mindsets. So the habits that we have in technology are now bleeding over into everything else we do, even how we read when we're not on technology. And I'm curious if you can just speak to that, because as I heard you describe that, I felt like it was very true for me, and I'm trying to be more thoughtful about it. But I think it's such a powerful metaphor for how it's not just that this is something happening on the device. Now what's happening on the device is forming a mindset that then is carrying over into all other aspects of our life. And you can describe it much better, but I wanted to kind of ask you to describe that mindset idea that comes out of your research.
Right. Seth, it's such an important area of research. And for me, it's not just research, it's a belief in the fact that each of us, from your standpoint as a commentator and a bringer of great ideas, and me as a researcher and as a mother and as a hope someday grandmother, I want humanity to preserve its best as we expand. And here I say this because people easily mistakenly feel that I am making a binary between technology and print. What I am doing, and it is very important for people to understand, is to say something like the philosopher Nicholas of Cusa years ago, when there are two contradicting truths.
Right.
One truth is technology is one of the most important aspects of progress in our human species. Second, technology is changing how we use our brains in such ways that we may not be utilizing the very information at its best level that technology produces. And what Nicholas of Cusa said, when these two contradicting truths happen, we should take a stance of learned ignorance. And that is what I try to do in my work. I try to look at the advantages of the affordance of technology for some things, and I look at the advantages that we will ignore at our loss in what print gives us. So there's no binary here. Rather, there is trying to understand, and this is the words of my MIT colleague, Sherry Turkle. It's not an error for society to make innovations. It is an error not to understand what they disrupt or diminish. So from the standpoint of learned ignorance, I am trying to, with my colleagues like Naomi Barron, the e-read network in Europe and in Israel, we are all trying to understand what is disrupted and diminished by technology, by the fact that the dominant mode of our reading, just as you said, bleeds over. It bleeds over even when we're reading print. We have a mindset, if you will, as Steven Pinker uses the term, a habit of mind to read quickly. The eye movement research tells us that we are often using an F, sample the top, go to the middle and go down, or a Z, sample top, word spot down, and go to the end. We even see this in an analysis of graduate students writing. What they are reading is the beginning, a little bit in the middle, and the end. That is not the full use of the circuit. So when you have these two truths, that this, if you will, the print medium, which we have used so well, helps advantage the deep reading, very time consuming processes. We have to ask, when is that best used? And when we see that this is advantaging what we have to do, which is, and you and I have to do this all day, 10 hours, 8 to 10 hours on the screen. We have to be able to assess the importance of the information, get the gist, and move on. But I would suggest that, if you will, the middle ground is to ask the question of our attentional system. What is the purpose? What is the major purpose of reading this material? If it's my email, forgive me, those who write me 100 to 200 a day, I have to use the most superficial use of my circuit until I stop and see this is requiring me to do X. And then I absolutely have to use all of my, if you will, cognitive patience, something we lose so quickly on the screen. I have to induce, I have to bring to bear my cognitive patience and either read it in a different mode. You can read deeply on a screen, but it takes effort and intentionality. But if it's really important, or if it's beautiful, let us not forget beauty, the perception of beauty in literature. Then I print it out. I also, and I know you heard the Ezra Klein, he asked me, so what do you do about it? So I'm going to say a real fast version. People, if they want to hear the Ezra Klein, get a bigger version. I bookend my days so that I begin with reading John Donne or Marilynne Robinson or Lydia Davis or, oh goodness, philosophers, theologians, people who will make me, the material itself, stops me and forces me, invites me to remember the reader I was. Reader come home, most people don't realize that it's about coming home to ourselves, our former reading sanctuary. And if you don't mind, Seth, I would like 1 or 2 more minutes about that reading sanctuary, because I talked about the penultimate cognitive processes, but I didn't talk about the ultimate ones. Do you mind if I take it?
Absolutely, go there, and then we have lots of wonderful questions. So let's hear about the ultimate, and then we'll jump into them.
Okay, so I hope I prepared you with this circuit that's ever evolving, or potentially ever evolving, but it can also digress. it can regress. It can use itself in a very superficial, shallow way. But it also never loses, if you have the intentionality, it never loses the capacity to take all of those critical, analytic, empathic processes and then give an extra moment of time to what I call the contemplative function. The contemplative function is not unlike what Aristotle asked of us when he was asked what makes a good society. Well, he said a good society is a society that is productive, builds knowledge. That's the first life of a good society. The second life is one where it uses the arts, leisure, entertainment. But that the third life of a good society is the society that reflects and contemplates, has insights into itself. I say the very same thing that Aristotle said about the good reader. The contemplative function is the sanctuary. It's the place we can go to find out what we think, our insights into what we are reading, our insights into how what we read can influence our lives and even transform them. So this contemplative function is generative. It helps us build insights and ahas, eurekas. This is one of the most important, beautiful, and most easily lost aspect of deep reading. And I do not want a single member of this audience to go away without thinking, examine yourself. And if you are finding you are losing these contemplative aspects, I want you to think about this one line from Proust that, well, maybe I'll give you two last lines from Proust. When he wrote about what's at the heart of reading, he said, at the heart of reading, we go beyond the wisdom of the author to discover our own. That's what we must never lose. We must never lose the capacity for appreciating what is good, what is true, what is just, and what is beautiful. And that's what this deep reading process can really give us in terms of wisdom. So I guess that's where I why not end with
that is an
wisdom?
ultimate place to finish. And you have, not surprisingly, sparked lots of really wonderful questions. And so we'll get to as many of them as we can. There are a number of questions in here where people acknowledge there's a difference between what they do with their email and when they're reading quickly, and then when they're deeply reading a book. A question that's come up a number of times, though, can you read deeply? And I know you can if you put a certain energy into it, from what you said, but when you're on an iPad, or now they have the Kindle White, which is supposed to be as close to the real. And so I'm curious if you could just talk to the many questions that have come up from people who, for convenience, for speed, for other things, want to read deeply, but are curious about could they use a technology and just how, there's different aspects of your rationale, right? One is that when you're skimming email or things like that, you're not really trying to read deeply. There's a ton of information. And so here are people saying, well, what if I just take this book, but it's on technology versus print? Does that still inhibit my ability to read deeply? And what's your thought on that question?
It's such a good question. And some of my colleagues like Anne Mangan in Norway are really trying to understand the depth of that question, because it is changing under our fingertips, so to speak, as technology. And I wrote this more than 10 years ago, that it is not my hope to damn technology at all. I am a researcher who utilizes it every day. It is not my intention to damn, but it is my intention to awaken us to the realities of what technology with the screen can do in different ways. And
Yeah.
I said then, it is my hope that the entity can redress its own weaknesses.
Yeah.
And that's where your question actually I inserted. I think many people in technology, and if I have given talks to people in Silicon Valley who afterwards, behind the screens, will say, not my children. I never let my kids on the screen. And I think, oh, for God's sake, you know, do you tell other people this? We are at this moment that is both very ominous in the sense that just like the tobacco industry knew full well that it was addicting, well, many people in technology know full well they are addicting our young and our young parents who are so tired and busy that they mistakenly think that the iPad and all these digital devices actually are enhancing the learning of their children, when in fact the research shows that if you compare, and this is brain imaging research by John Houghton and in the Midwest in Cincinnati, he showed that if you have the same story read by the parent or the caretaker versus heard in an audio version versus in an iPad where there's all the bells and whistles, the activation of the language regions is best when there's this interactive real human being reading, and worst with the iPad, which makes for great engagement, but addicts the child to speed and distraction.
Yeah.
People talk about dopamine lollipops. Well, the dopamine lollipop for the child is the same dopamine lollipop for us. We need to examine that. But that does not mean there's not better and worse. As time passes, I believe we will get better and better. I certainly have a Kindle. On every airplane, I take a book bag with the things that I really want to read, and I take my Kindle that I have, and I have read that, if you will, superficial novel. Everybody needs different things. By the end of the plane, I get off and put my Kindle away. It doesn't mean, however, that we can't do deep reading on the screen. It just means it's not the same. And it isn't the same in terms of what we call comprehension monitoring. There's many things I would like, maybe if people would actually read my book, there'll be a much more elaborated, and if you will, evidence-based response. But the reality is that the screen does not paralyze you and say, oh my gosh, I haven't understood this, and I'll just go back. What it does is it speeds you along. Whatever the medium is, we have, again, I use the term mindset. The evanescence, the transitory nature gives us a set to finishing it, a set to keep going instead of what's called comprehension monitoring. Print's physicality is something that needs to be even better understood that we do. There are people who study this, but the physicality actually is helping us use spatial cognition in there. And so when I know that I have missed or misunderstood, I know by going back 3 pages, I can find it on the lower left corner. I have a spatial representation that we don't even perceive. But I do want to say that there's a really important study, it's slightly older now, it's 2017, in which my colleagues in Spain and eRead in Europe looked at the same little love story, or let's just say the same content, and they looked at it in print and screen with young adults, 171,000. And what you see is that the comprehension And that's really what I'm talking about. Comprehension monitoring, sequencing of details. They were simply better with print,
Hmm.
even though my Israeli colleagues showed that they thought they perceived themselves better on the screen. And when asked why, they said, because we're faster.
Yeah,
Well,
they're not reading as
speed is
deeply.
a piece of all of this. The set to speed, the set not to go back. You can go back, but you don't.
Well, so a follow-up question, just because there's so many questions in the Q&A on this, is related to audiobooks. And
Ah, yes.
more broadly, there are some questions about all the other ways now we consume information via voice, meaning podcast. And can, it sounded like when you were giving us a bit of a spectrum, right? Of
Mhm.
like, here's the dopamine where, the iPad gives us all sorts of visuals and interaction, and then here's the parent reading or the child reading. It sounded like audio maybe was somewhere in the middle, but just the science on audiobooks and more broadly audio-based learning, which has become a much more dominant form than it was decades ago.
Yeah. Um, as someone who gives it about 1 to 2 podcasts a week, the
I'm the
very
problem, it's me. Yeah.
I love actually seeing you, Seth. But the last thing I want to do is say podcasts don't teach, because they do. I
Yeah.
will say that what I very much appreciate, and actually, Ezra Klein did this, he provides both the transcript and the
Right.
audio. And there are both differences in individual learning styles that are a piece of the response, but there are differences in how immersed we can be in the audio. I feel very positive about audio. I work with a lot of children um, who are these creative minds that we call dyslexic. But my painting by Ben Wolf, Noam back there, my son, the dyslexic artist from LA and New York. Um, the audio has been extremely helpful in his ability to, for example, read my book.
Yeah.
Neither
Yeah.
of my sons, I know this, they both used audio for their mother's books, right?
Well,
So
I think you're
their
beating
memory.
most parents. Your kids read your books in any form. That's a big skill.
Well, that might be true. And but I want to say there is a spectrum.
Yeah.
And there is also room for difference. And I want to suggest that we can learn so much from the audio. But I think we must never neglect when there's something extremely important for us to understand the value, the advantages of print. So I'm both a proponent of the audio version, but just like the screen, you can go back, but you don't.
Right.
So the monitoring is not the same. So that if this is how I look at the audio, it has wonderful assets, and it also has some of the same detriments that the
Yeah.
screen, but not as many, especially in the area of distraction.
There are a number of questions in the Q&A around how we essentially convince parents and children about the magic of reading and deep reading in particular, and how we help them to understand the potential dangers. Are there, I mean, in addition to your two great books, are there other resources out there, especially kid-friendly? There are a number of teachers that are listening today that want to
Mm.
bring this to their students that you recommend for helping to build both the joy and magic of reading and also understanding the context, especially for children, in how they should approach their learning journey.
There is nothing like a parent or a caretaker or a sibling reading to the child to give the magic.
Yeah.
I if I could do, it sounds rather odd, but if I could do one or two things to change the equation, it would be to begin in that 0 to 5 period with parents reading to their children every night. and things that delight them too. Now, you might have to read in the great green room, there is a telephone with a red balloon. You might have to read that multiple times and be told, oh, you skipped. I don't care. What you are doing is encouraging that love of reading, but it doesn't end at 5. One of the things that I really feel that people don't even try to do is read with their children at night, read with them in vacations. Just maybe a little bit every night. Keep us suspenseful, but you are conveying your love, and they love us and they want to be like us. And when we are always on our phones and we're always in our screens, what do they think? So the example and reading to the children. I can remember reading to our kids about, oh gosh, I think the last vacation that was when they were in, one of them was, Ben was in the 8th grade. And then we stopped, and then the kids said, why did you stop reading to us? We assume they don't want it, but
Right.
we really have so much to give them ourselves. But that means recovering sometimes our love. And so reading to our children, whether we're the teacher or the sibling or the parent, use it as an opportunity to remember and to experience your own love of reading. And for some people, they never had that. And
Yeah.
that is a wonderful thing to be able to convey. Gavin Newsom is our governor in California and is dyslexic and has talked about how he didn't get that sense of joy. Well, we can give every child the desire to have that joy, whether we're dyslexic or struggling reader, give that joy. It is one of the most important, beautiful acts in the first year of a child's life, to be under the crook of an arm with a parent and hearing them read. Never, never, never lose that.
We are running short on time, and I apologize because we could not get through the more than 50 questions that came in, but we will not only send this video out afterward, we'll also include the Ezra Klein conversation and some other resources so you can deeply investigate Dr. Wolf's books and her work. Let me ask you just
Naomi Barron just wrote a really good book. I have the preface or forward, but she really did a great job too. There's so many good people.
So the kind of power question at the end, we have about 60 seconds remaining. Your favorite book and why? So what's a book that, you're a deep reader that really changed you? Because I think all of us would love to benefit from your reading list.
Oh, I was given that task in Ezra Klein and I lied. I didn't know I was lying, because I said Gilead and this work of theology and Gistian, and they were all true. They are all I love these books. But the truth is, and my kids reminded me, Middlemarch and Brothers Karamazov, but especially Middlemarch. And that book I have read at least, it's embarrassing. Well, it's not embarrassing. 7 times with 7 different readings. And the older I get, the more I realize about Dorothea and how actually George Eliot was really teaching us so much about love, and that we don't have to be these extraordinary individuals who are heroes or heroines. By looking at our daily life for what is good, for what is true, what is just, and what is beautiful, that each of us make a contribution that maybe no one knows, but that's what we did with our lives. And so Middlemarch has taught me so much about life.
Well, what a beautiful way to end. And I'll just share that our chat is literally lighting up with all of the thank yous from people who love this conversation, including one, Tomoko, who says that you were their favorite professor back in 1990 at Tufts, and they followed your work ever since, and they are grateful to see you over the screen. So we'll count that as one of the benefits of technology, that you can continue to engage with students more than 3 decades later who still remember the imprint that you had on them.
Oh,
So
I almost remember her because of her name. It's such a gorgeous name, Tomoko Wakabayashi, I think is how you pronounce it.
yes, that is right. Yes.
Oh, I'm so happy. Oh, now you've given me a gift. So now the
Well,
reciprocal is always best.
a perfect way to end. Thank you for a joyful and truly insightful conversation, and look forward to continuing that conversation in the years ahead as we hopefully find the balance between deep thought and reading and our ever technologized world. And thank you all for joining us in technology for this
Yes.
conversation.
And thank you, Seth, in particular, for inviting me. Obviously, you are my ideal reader.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure. And have a good day to everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.